Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Kerr. I'm happy to be here with you today, albeit virtually and pre-recorded, along with my colleague, Jose Díaz. We're going to present jointly today. I'm going to introduce myself now, and then Jose will introduce himself later when he picks up the presentation. I'm a professor in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. In 2018-19, I was a visiting fellow at FAO in the Forest and Farm facility. Jose and I are producing a short overview of a toolkit that we produced last year. The text has been finalized, but the toolkit is still in production. The topic of our toolkit is connecting forest and farm producer organizations to climate change finance. Climate change finance has the potential to be a very effective source of funding for small farmers to help them take steps to increase their resilience and reduce risk. Our target audience is apex-level forest and farm producer organizations, or FFPOs. These are national or regional bodies that represent local-level forest and farm producer organizations. For a reason that we will explain, to the extent that local FFPOs are able to access climate change finance, it's certain to come through apex-level bodies. These are the four sections of our presentation today, which largely map onto the contents. We'll give it a little background, talk about how FFPOs can present themselves as good partners for climate change finance, some steps that they can take, the actual steps to take to connect, and some challenges that the Apex FFPOs can face if they are able to access climate change finance. Before we start, I just want to say that we look very broadly at what Apex FFPOs need to do to access climate change finance. Every country is different and depends on a lot of factors, and what Apex FFPOs need to do is going to vary depending on those factors. So as a result, it's not possible to produce a universally applicable guide with specific steps for any given Apex FFPO in any given country to follow for accessing global climate change funds. So instead, what we offer is a guide for Apex FFPOs to figure out what they need to do given their particular context in order to set themselves up to access climate finance. Okay. There's a number of multilateral and global and bilateral sources of finance that are available in support of efforts of countries in the global south to contribute to climate change mitigation and to adapt to the negative effects of climate change. In the toolkit, we give a brief overview of the kinds of practices for climate mitigation and adaptation that forest and farm producers could implement. We avoided going into detail due to the great differences across contexts. In fact, I'm going to skip all that here because thanks to the magic of pre-recording, we found out that when I tried to go into it a little bit, we went over time. And this audience is likely familiar with the relevant kinds of practices anyway. So returning to these sources of global climate change finance, the pool of these funds is quite vast. However, the processes for distributing funds are complex and not completely transparent. The multilateral funding sources are linked to the international climate change agreements under the UNFCCC. These agreements represent national commitments to the international community. As such, in nearly all cases, multilateral funds are allocated in any given country in coordination with a national liaison office that acts as the connection between the national government and the global finance authorities. For climate change mitigation, this is necessary to incorporate resulting carbon sequestration or emissions reductions into national level carbon accounting in cooperation with the UNFCCC. This means that accessing such funds is only feasible via arrangements with that office. To date, around the world, there are some examples of smallholder FFPs accessing climate mitigation and adaptation funds, but they are the exception globally, and they all involve cases where the FFPO's representatives are in close coordination with the relevant government authorities. Accessing bilateral funds is less daunting in principle, but it still requires presenting FFPOs as an attractive partner to execute climate change mitigation and adaptation priority actions and making this case to those who control the funds. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jose Díaz to talk about how Apex FFPOs can make the case for accessing climate change funds and for taking the steps to actually do so, including establishing a relationship with the national level liaison office for multilateral climate finance.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Jose Díaz. I am the officer for producer organizations from the Social Forestry team at the FAO Forestry Department. Now I'm glad to continue with the presentations. I'm going to address some basic steps that FBOs can take to access climate finance, but also some things that they need to reflect on in order to improve their chances to access it. One of the things that FBOs can think about on how to represent themselves as a good partners to access climate finance is that they are an essential vehicles for mobilizing small-scale producers. Why? Well, it's known that in cases where the enable condition exists, the FBOs can make enormous contributions in the achievements of targets. FBOs have a local understanding on how climate change affects their livelihoods and have the knowledge that can be used to develop well-adapted practices to address it. At the ground level, they are one of the best channels to exchange experiences and knowledge among farmers and producers. And they are also well positioned for delivering capacity building services to their members. So they are fundamental on the ground. One of the main strengths of producer organizations is their ability to mobilize their members to work collectively, because they have strong local norms, practices, and rules. This helps to build social cohesion and allow FBOs to create incentives for internal cooperations. These aspects are fundamental to build trust among peers and to facilitate the exchange of experiences. The exchange of successful local experiences in the management of natural resource, family farming, agroecology, etc., is an important vehicle for scaling up practices and achieving ambitious goals at landscape or regional or even national level. In many cases, however, it's not feasible for a larger climate funding organization to work directly with local level actors. For this organization, it's costly and it's not practical to work with a small organization. They usually cannot give funds directly to them. Therefore, it's here where Apex FBOs can bridge the gap and serve as an intermediary to local producer organizations and then turn to local farmers and farm producers. So Apex organizations can provide the assurance to finance institutions that local groups can deliver the agreed upon activities and targets. Also, it's important to reflect on that in cases where FBOs are well articulated in strong Apex organization and enjoy adequate policy support, especially from governments, this organization can become a very important player on the ground, and they can become a fundamental partner to implement climate change finance and scale up successful practices and to achieve transformational change. However, it's important to note that around the globe, smallholders, local communities, and producer organizations are still struggling with several issues that limit their performance. For example, they face tenure insecurity risks, lack of direct support to develop their capacities and organizational skills. They usually don't have access to financial resources and incentives, and in many cases, local groups are marginalized in policy development consultation. So it's here also where Apex organization can help to overcome these barriers and then access to climate finance. Another aspect is that FBOs should highlight their possible roles in implementing climate change mitigation adaptation funds. And Apex organization can contribute in a number of specific areas related to climate change actions. They can help in organizing and providing training services to their members. participate in the decentralized implementation of climate finance, and to deliver valuable outcomes in result-based payment, for example, in RED Plus initiatives, in payment for ecosystem services, and in landscape restoration initiatives. There are several examples across the globe on how FBOs are actively contributing in achieving climate targets. And also, it's important to reflect that meeting climate change mitigation commitments requires moving beyond public lands. And this aspect is connecting to ensuring the rights and access of local communities, indigenous peoples, and smallholders to forests. And providing them these rights brings several benefits because it not only present the opportunity for cost-effective carbon mitigations through reducing deforestation, but it also can help to achieve adaptation targets such as generating income and securing livelihoods of forest-dependent people. We know that across the globe, millions of hectares are in the hands of communities. But also some data suggests that many people depend and rely on forests as well. So those people and their lands and forests are key to achieve climate change commitments. This is particularly important since several studies have already reported that the areas managed by local groups present lower deforestation rates, lower incidence of forest fires, etc., in comparison with state-owned forests. So if governments want to achieve some targets, they should work together with communities, small farmers, and rural organizations. Having already mentioned the importance that FBOs have in the implementation of both climate change adaptation and mitigation practices, now in this section, briefly, I'm going to present some actions that FBOs can take to increase their opportunities to connect to climate finance programs. One of the steps is that FBOs need to understand the climate risks and the necessary responses for their members. The FBOs should answer what kind of climate adaptation measures they need to undertake and what kind of assistance they need to deliver to the members in order to do so. Also, FBOs must be able to collect and provide detailed information about their members and what they have to offer. This is an important step for accessing climate finance, but it's also important for accessing another kind of opportunity, more generally speaking. Apex organizations should know how many local FBOs they represent, how many members, how many farmers they have, the area that FBOs have under management, and how many trees they have planted, how many trees they are managing, etc. This kind of data provides information on the scale and information on the potential that they have to work in climate change mitigation and adaptation initiatives. Also, Apex FBOs should be able to provide the evidence of the achievements they have made as a way of demonstrating their capacity to deliver services to their members. FBOs should demonstrate as well that they have functional organizations with active members that are actively involved and working in climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, and sustainable practices at farm and landscape level. They should highlight their own profile on what they are doing. Additionally, Apex FBOs should have a knowledge on how climate finance works and the existing regulatory framework. Usually, small farmers, FBOs, and local groups, they often find many problems on understanding how these agreements are structured and the different national strategies funded. And this kind of information constitutes literally a very strong barrier for them in accessing finance, climate change finance. But the Apex FBOs, on the other hand, can unlock this information and establish a stronger voice and gain a seat in the planning, designing, and implementation processes of projects. So in this way, they can bring their own members, their small farmers, into the climate change arena. Another step is to identify the financial management capacities of their members prior delivering funds to them. This step is essential for being able to deliver on any promises to sources of finance. Because if institutions, financial institutions provide their finance to these organizations, and if they are not well prepared to manage it, what might happen is that rather than providing a benefit, these funds might create internal conflicts and erode the incentives for internal cooperation. So Apex FBOs should be aware on what kind of capacities and skills need to be strengthened to the members in order to be able to manage this. Finally, FBO should have a robust monitoring and reporting mechanism to track progress in adaptation and mitigation efforts. For sure, these steps will require very technical, highly technical assistance to implement it, but it's really important to demonstrate their capacities to manage and to achieve the targets to what they were committed. If this is not in place, they should work on it, because larger financial institutions, climate finance institution, requires a lot of information and a lot of reporting processes in order to be able to access these funds. Now, having already navigated through these previous slides, it's important to reflect on some key questions that might help Apex FBOs to assess what kind of information they need to collect and what kind of steps they need to take in order to access finance. Some key questions are related to if they know the overall climate change architecture at country level. They should be aware of this country context in order to be able to participate in. They should know if their members, if they in itself are being part on the consultations of the different planning tools related to the UNFCCC. If they don't, they should be part of. So, but the only way how to be part of this kind of process is to have the information, but to be highly and actively involved into the discussions. Also, they should ask themselves to what extent the concrete commitments and partners towards climate change projects and actions will affect positively or negatively their livelihoods, their rights over lands and access to natural resources. When they apply to climate change finance, usually they commit to certain compromises. So they need to balance if the benefits outweigh some risk or not. So they should be aware of all these kind of regulatory processes. So the only way how to be aware of this is, again, to participate in the consultation and planning process. To the end, also, they should be aware, should be sure if their partners, the organization, are already prepared to receive climate funds. They should ask themselves if the organizations have the technical and financial capacities to implement and to monitor and report the commitments. If they don't, they should set certain capacity building processes in order to overcome this weakness. So to finalize, I want to just briefly present how the climate change financial architecture is. It's quite complex. Sometimes it's not easy to understand, but overall there are two types of finance. We have the multilateral finance and the bilateral finance. The multilateral finance usually comes under the umbrella of the UNFCCC, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the Global Environmental Facility. But there are another kind of multilateral funds that, despite that, are not under the umbrella of the UNFCCC. All the activities they fund are connected to concrete commitments in order to achieve the UNFCCC targets. So Apex FBO should be aware how these different things works. Something important is like all these funds are sometimes connected with implementing agencies, which means these funds are not given directly to countries. Countries need to partner with these implemented agencies. So if farmers want to be part of this, the easiest way how to be connected is through larger apex organizations that might have a stronger voice rather than small single organizations. Then we have the bilateral finance that usually this finance are not strongly connected with the UNFCCC, but the donor countries usually they want to provide finance to countries in order to achieve national commitments. These bilateral funds are administered largely through already existing development agencies from these developed countries, and they operate in specific and in target countries. So all these funds that you can see on the screen are not available in all the world. They work in specific countries. So apex organizations should be aware if these funds are available at their own country, and also to see and to realize what are the main implementing agencies, the development agency that is administering these funds, and what are the main guidelines to apply to these different financial sources. Usually, despite that this bilateral finance is a little bit more flexible than the multilateral, sometimes they are still connected with governmental focal points. For example, the IKI initiatives. Each project that are submitted to the IKI program usually have to be approved for a governmental focal point. Again, that's why it's important that apex organizations should be connected in all these kind of governmental initiatives and planning process. All this information will be presented in the toolkit that we hope to be published sooner. And then this information, the webpage, the main guidelines, the requisites to access to these funds, and also some examples of successful projects will be presented in the toolkits. And this information can be used by the organizations for the FBOs in order to get an overall understanding to what they need to do in order to access them. So that's from my side, and now I'm giving the floor to my colleague, John. Thank you very much.
As apex FFPOs consider the steps they need to take to access climate finance, important issues arise about the need to be prepared for the financial management this will entail. This section of the toolkit addresses two main points in this regard. One is the need for local FFPOs to have a well-developed and transparent financial management and accounting system, and the dangers of allocating funds to local FFPOs that do not have such a system in place. The other is the potential pressure that apex FFPOs might face to distribute funds to local FFPOs that are not prepared to manage them successfully. So regarding the first of these two items, regarding transparency, local FFPOs need excellent arrangements for managing funds as a collective. This is something they need anyway, but all the more so if they are trying to access climate finance. So they need a clear accounting system that distinguishes between individual and collective expenses and returns, and systems for determining the differences between them, etc. Transparency requires a system that allows all FFPO members to be able to see the accounts and to understand what's happening. In contrast, for an FFPO that's just getting established, poor financial management can destroy everything it's trying to do. This is because every aspect of strengthening an FFPO requires trust among its members. Anything that undermines trust, such as suspicion about whether finances are managed correctly, can bring to a halt the successful development of an FFPO. As the logical vehicle for FFPOs to access climate finance, apex FFPOs will also have a great deal of responsibility for determining which FFPOs, which local FFPOs are eligible to receive the funds, and for assuring that they actually use the funds as intended in a way that improves climate change mitigation and/or adaptation, including meeting the obligations, the nation's obligations to the UNFCCC. One step they can take is to identify whether a local FFPO has developed adequate procedures for managing external funds, including those clear rules and procedures for members to follow, etc. FFPOs can develop their own, Apex FFPOs can develop their own sets of indicators or benchmarks for whether such factors are in place, and they should apply them well in advance of a specific decision regarding which FFPOs will receive funding. Okay, on to the second item. In any given country, if an Apex FFPO is able to attract global climate funding, the sum of that money is likely to be quite large relative to what they are accustomed to attracting and managing, and they may face pressure to distribute it more quickly than they would like to. The large sum is likely as a way for donors to reduce their transaction costs. Issuing a grant involves high administrative costs of setting up the grant, managing it, and monitoring it. So a donor would prefer to give large grants rather than small ones. If Apex FFPOs want to get involved in multilateral climate finance, this is one of the things they have to figure out how to deal with. The pressure to spend funds quickly is just a bureaucratic reality. Once a donor organization decides on a path for allocating its funds, its immediate objective is to make sure that the entire allocation for each year is expended as planned. The same is true for national organizations responsible for attracting funds from international donors. Once a project is in place, they're responsible for making sure that all the funds are actually allocated and all the obligations to the global community are met. All this means is that often it is in the interest of all concerned parties, the international donor, the national representative's office, and the ultimate recipient, to push the money through quickly. This creates a potential paradox. Apex FFPOs that receive funds must be very careful to allocate them only to local FFPOs that have the capacity to manage them effectively, and yet pressure to spend the money quickly works directly against that need. It's worth emphasizing again that if an Apex FFPO were to find itself in this situation, it would not only risk failing to deliver on its promise to execute a project for climate change mitigation or adaptation, it would also risk undermining the development of FFPOs by potentially triggering disputes and distrust created by the inability to manage the funds effectively. It risks undermining all of the local FFPOs' objectives, not just those pertaining to global climate change. To address this potential problem requires that Apex FFPOs consciously try to avoid accepting more funding than they know they can process. This is obviously a balancing act, since their first task that we've been talking about is to convince the donors that they are in fact capable. One solution is for Apex FFPOs to try to access global climate finance as part of a coalition as opposed to on their own. For example, in partnerships like with organizations like Conservation International and IUCN that have figured out how to access climate finance. For example, a climate change adaptation project could involve the work of smallholder forest and farm producers only as one component of a larger project. The overall project might still have a huge budget that satisfies the need to minimize transaction costs, but the portion allocated to FFPOs could be more manageable. Another possibility is that there are examples in which a large global climate change adaptation project operates in several countries within a region, not just one. If funds in a large project were allocated entirely to FFPOs, but across several countries, the budget that a given Apex FFPO in a given country must distribute would be more manageable. None of these approaches is likely to emerge overnight. All of them can only be pursued if Apex FFPOs are able to gradually develop a relationship with the national authority that is the liaison with global climate change funds. Okay, well, that wraps up our presentation. I'm sorry we weren't able to show you the actual toolkit as it's still in production. It contains a lot of text boxes, examples, and with a detailed appendix describing the different climate change mitigation and adaptation funds. And as I said, it also contains all kinds of links to other resources that may be useful. I'm hopeful that it will be published soon. Thank you.